It was intended for the human to support the machine to support the human.
And AI means something different to anybody you talk to, which is wild.
This is AI or Die.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to AI or Die podcast episode 19. Good to have you back, everybody. Brendan, Reagan, good to see you guys. How you doing?
Doing good. It's good to be here.
Good. Well, we are here in the holiday season. The holiday season's already getting kicked off with Gen AI Coca-Cola ads and just general Gen AI videos, movies. I feel like this is my opinion. We've reached a point now where everyone's kind of tired of these like Gen AI videos and art and things like that too.
Totally.
The novelty is gone. The novelty is no longer there.
The novelty is
it's like everybody's seen it already. It's not a big deal.
And I feel like everybody's gotten really good at pointing it out and being like, oh yeah, it's Gen AI here, here, and here. Like you can see the aberrations in the photo or whatever too. So I feel like that Coca-Cola ad was kind of like and just the backlash that it got was kind of like feedback to companies. Let's do less like Gen AI ads. Let's do less video production with Gen AI. I was thinking that, and then I read in the news this morning that there's a whole Andreessen Horowitz-backed startup that's all about just making movies and producing movies and TV series using AI and Gen AI as well to make everything more efficient.
So, here's my thought, though. We wouldn't know if it got so good that it was undetectable because we wouldn't know because it's undetectable. So, like, we might be inching into that territory. We just don't know.
So my thoughts were like with this one and the Jaguar ad that got big because it didn't show any cars and it was more like, artsy or theoretical, right? I was like, do they do it on purpose? Like, do the marketing people be like, okay, we need like us, like, because if the goal of an ad is to get attention, like Coca-Cola is getting talked about,
okay,
news, right? So like, do they throw a couple like this is intentionally bad or outside just so people talk about it, because then it accomplishes its job as an ad,
Any publicity is good publicity. So let's just do rage bait and put that out there and just see people engage with it in some way or another. Not a crazy out of bounds tactic, Brendan, now that you mentioned that. I could see that as well.
We should do a crazy commercial. We should just have someone praising an AI overlord or something and just say,
I saw on X, actually, there was a company, and I cannot remember the company's name, but they were making fun of the Humane ad where they kind of like frame by frame reenacted the Humane ad. I don't know if you guys have seen that. It's like a video that they created promoting that. I think it's called Humane. It's that pin that has AI that can see what's going on.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a bad ad. But this company like mocked it and kind of recreated it for their product. And that one I feel like went more viral. It was actually quite funny. I was watching it and I was like, I didn't even see the Humane ad before that. So I thought it was kind of odd. And then somebody was in the comments or replies was talking about it. So it took me to the Humane ad too. So I feel like any publicity is good publicity.
And I'm sure they just figured they would figure out the legal implications later, just in terms of literally mocking another ad with Gen AI, recreating it in that way too.
People get kind of clever,
Yep. So that is, commercial news. On more of the like enterprise and real kind of governance, Gen AI news side of things as well. It seems like a lot of CIOs, especially in the tail end of this year, there's just a feature article in CIO magazine. They talk a lot about and I think we're seeing this in people that we work with as well, is just the focus on value. We mentioned this at the top of the year. I feel like it's continuing to become something that they're hitting up against just in terms of the urgency to show impact of AI and Gen AI, while also trying to manage all of that at scale with a budget that really needs to be justified by ROI from a lot of the initiatives that are getting implemented as well too. So it just seems like the value just continues to be top of mind for a lot of leaders who are managing these initiatives and scaling these programs as well. And I'm just very curious how, just looking ahead into 2025, that'll be something that hopefully gets unlocked a little bit more. People figure out a more pragmatic way to measure that. I just wanted to get your guys' thoughts on that too. It's something that certainly will not go away, and just how leaders especially should think about that when they're prioritizing AI initiatives.
Yeah, I'm starting to think about this more and more too, because like the reality in the enterprise, like if we would say, AI should be safer, AI should be more valuable, is like we're basically need to form a team or a function that stops the project and reviews it, right? So like we have an assembly line of AI projects. Like if we want to check to make sure everything is of quality, value, all this stuff, right? We need to stop the line, check it out, and then keep going. And I feel like that's where we're seeing a lot of teams struggle with. I know one team before a project would start, they had like 7 review points from different perspectives. And then once the project started to get to production, there's something like 8 with another customer that we're working with. So I've been thinking about this more and more, and it's something we're looking at with the product, of course, is like every time we introduce more controls or more structure, more better practices to get that value, to get that safety, to, meet the needs of the organization, we also introduce a lot or a little bit of friction, right? So how do we reduce that friction of like having people stop and look at it? How can we automate these checks or these controls of like quality in that car, that assembly line that we're building? So we don't need to like stop it, figure out what to look for, and then move it forward, because I think this is the reality of coming from an innovation side to the main stage, right? Where AI is right now, of like operationally we need to generate value, and therefore we needed to do all these things to fit inside the organization. I think that's what we're seeing a lot of teams struggle with, is like meeting all those needs while also delivering that value.
Yeah, I think the quality checks, to your point, are going to be the hardest part. If you think about assembly, even like, auto manufacturers or the assembly process, they do quality checks throughout the entire assembly process. And part of those quality checks are actually kind of destructive, right? Like if you're trying to check the quality of a weld, sometimes you have to destroy that part to check the quality and do a spot check, right? Or you have to stop the line, or like it can get really hard to determine quality along the way, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think generative AI is introducing more and more complex quality checks. And so to your point, Brendan, it's slowing things down for companies because of that. I also just did a whole presentation at Open Data Science Conference in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago around measuring value of AI. And I think one of the trends that we're seeing, and most definitely from an enterprise lens, is we don't want to introduce like 80,000 new processes and controls inside of our organization. What can we leverage that we already have that we can use for AI, right? And so innovation teams have a general process around measuring potential, benefits to innovation projects, which is a little squishy and hard, right? And then you've got your operational excellence teams who are very, very used to identifying, cost-cutting potential savings, either soft savings or hard savings, and they're used to assessing that up front, and they're also used to measuring those implementations. And if it's not AI, or if it is AI, it's automation in some cases at the end of the day. And there's ways to calculate that already. And so we're starting to see some of the companies pair AI capabilities under their existing operational excellence teams or innovation teams, because that structure is already there. So I think that'll continue to happen. There's so much work. I don't know why people are so annoyed with operational excellence use cases, because there's so much work to be done there, especially at an enterprise level. They like cannot get their heads past that. They like want to have this big breakthrough moment with AI on this huge innovative, initiative. And it's like, why are you not just focusing on reducing the enormous amount of waste that sits inside of your company that keeps you from moving quickly? Like there's just this endless list of waste to go after. And for some reason, people are just like very hesitant to focus just on that.
Yeah, and I think it's so tough too, because then if you talk about anything external facing, anything that creates more value for your customers or deepens your moat, like there's the risk of trying to do that, which is already very hard, especially in an enterprise. Then you add to that the other risk failure opportunity around the AI itself, the data itself, the security, the controls, you add that on top. That's why I think OpEx is great. A lot of internal apps is where people start. Because like you said, there's a lot of low hanging fruit there. There's a lot of like trust that you can build with the users. You don't have to worry about like mistakes. You can kind of iterate that with the business. And you don't have to worry about that added risk factor of going out externally, right?
It's the realization that it's still a human system integration that fits so well into an operational excellence, Lean Six Sigma, continuous improvement, and just the urgency of less about big swings for AI initiatives, more about like just show progress, just show value as soon as possible in weeks, not months, right? Just getting stuff out there. into the business's hands to get them to use it and drive additional ideas too.
I mean, think about this. Innovation projects are already insanely risky. Not even using AI, just in general. Like that is their job, is to come up with something drastically different, drastically innovative, outside of the norm. That is the innovation job, which means it comes with a lot of risk because you haven't done it. And then also throw AI into the mix. Like, why would you do that to yourself? That just sounds insane.
One flywheel that's starting to emerge that I wanted to also bring up just while we're talking about this, because it's related, is okay, so a lot of organizations are starting with having consulting firms or advisors come in and talk to the leadership around, okay, company specific strategy, what are AI initiatives that we should prioritize ultimately that align to our strategy. So kind of that top down sourcing of ideas. And a lot of teams are using those initial ideas and the pilots of those to show, hey, internal case study, we're able to implement a thing that's to add value. And now let's roadshow this idea around to start to get that flywheel going of getting additional ideas from the business. So it's like a starting top down with initiatives to drive a bottom up almost interest from the business and additional use cases coming in as well too. That's just something I've noticed that I think is interesting. And I wonder if I would love to debate on this, will there continue to be a more is more in terms of ideas coming from the business? Like, will that eventually be the primary source of AI initiatives and use cases coming in for that? Or do you think it'll still be a mix of top down every year, every couple of years, have advisors come in and to tell us what use cases to prioritize with the business also feeding ideas in there too? I want to get your guys' thoughts on that.
I feel like it'll both come from both directions, especially because like software had that too, right? Where there's like big top down stuff, there's the grassroots movements, especially when you think about like buying software, because like there's a million software products that are bought, especially inside the enterprises. So like I think there'll be kind of a mixture of the two. They'll keep going. I do think where AI might be different that gets interesting is like the no code, low code options like Copilot Studio, and there's also like Glean Writer tools like that, where I think they create this interesting middle ground where they could enable the business to just like self create some of the stuff that they want that's not readily available out of the box in functionality. But I don't know how long that stands up to how much easier code generation is getting. Like that to me feels like the big wild card in like tech in general right now is like, what does the world look like in 5 years with how good code generation is now with AI, and then how good it will be in 5 years? Like, does no code stand up in the enterprise? Do people want to build out more technical teams that can create a lot of this stuff more custom bespoke without too much effort? Like I think that will be kind of interesting to keep an eye on, because it could affect like how do we think about bottom up and top down.
Yeah, I was just at the Ohio AI Summit on Wednesday this week, and I was doing a sprint talk on, governing AI by design and blah, 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 which I guess we can talk about if we want to. But the other person who was presenting was from Google, and he was he threw a stat up there that 25% of code is written by AI today, which is crazy.
Significant. Yeah.
I mean, that is wild. And they're expecting that to increase drastically over the next year as well. So just to your point, I thought that was a pretty wild stat. Like I know that, code generation is a really great use case for generative AI. I know that. And we've seen that tons of times. It's just like wild to hear that. That's already that, ubiquitous. It's already adopted at that scale.
I wonder how that will continue to evolve, because that seems like the biggest leaps. The biggest leap this year was just getting that ability into people's hands, and that not every company has this quite yet, but it's getting there. But just like the amount that the average person who may not be as familiar with coding or a specific language is able to do now with deploying their own kind of agent, their own kind of Gen AI solution at their space, that also makes my alarms go off around like, with all of this stuff happening now, how do we, again, back to governance and your point, Reagan, like how do we keep a wrangle on all of these things that are happening across the area too?
Yeah, the more mature organizations that I'm talking to are starting to hit that point of a federated model with AI where, you originally centralize everything because you're trying to define the guardrails and you're trying to define the controls and the policies and the process that everybody goes through. And then once you feel good about running enough through that and you've caught everything from a risk perspective or everything that you can, you start to federate that out because you're like, okay, now we have a system in place that can start to manage and track a lot of that risk. And to your point, Brendan, like the low code, no code, plus the agent workflow idea, for a long time, we've had Power Automate inside of the Microsoft stack, and it's too complicated for non-technical people to work with. And that's an opportunity for people to automate their own work, and they still didn't, you know? And so does AI make that actually much easier? Does it abstract some of those complexities of automation away? And does working with agents and building agents and designing agents become a more like less complex task eventually? And I still think it's too challenging today. I've played around with a lot of the agentic development tools. They're kind of Zapier-esque. I don't know if you guys have played around with Zapier much, but like, right, you're connecting systems, and so you're connecting automations and creating toolkits for them and allowing them to do actions, and you're connecting data sets, and you're referencing certain things, or you're creating certain prompts that it can continue to generate over and over again. It's a lot of the automation around source data, context, actions, whatever, right? And I think a lot of it, people can think about what problems do I want to solve? But even business stakeholders, I would say, are still not great at that part either. So, like, even if they're, wanting to solve a problem, thinking through all the complexities of the stuff that they need for that solution to be effective is still kind of hard and onerous today. So I don't know. I don't know how fast that's going to move or what that's going to do.
You're so right, though, because it's classic stuff like root cause analysis. Like, would this solution truly solve the problem that I'm feeling today before we even get to what type of solution it is? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also so iterative too. And I think that's why I always come back to like the chat interface is actually really good on the LLMs. Like I was against it in the beginning, but now I'm like, oh, I see the value because I can keep coming back and saying like that was to this or that was to this. And like eventually we'll need to have more standalone apps that have that logic baked in of like what your preference is and what you're really looking to get out of it. But for today, I just feel like I can accomplish so many different tasks within those LLMs, like with a Claude, ChatGPT. It's like it is pretty insane to think through. Okay, like what if those get better, where they're pulling in more data, and like we put a schedule job on it? Like I wonder if like, well, I know a lot of those tools do that stuff, but also those foundational model companies have so much built up around there and so much value in it. It's kind of interesting to think through how that plays in as well as those get better and better.
Yeah, I was kind of talking to some folks too. Like, you used to need to know all the nuances of prompt engineering on these tools, and we're only 2 years in, right? But like, you used to need to know to tell it to be concise. You used to need to know to like tell it specific tones or specific information for it to get most of it right. And I think what's wild today is you don't really need as much detail in your prompt as you used to, even a year ago. And so we're starting to see like the things that you had to explicitly state are getting a little bit more baked in. And I was listening to Dario, the CEO of Anthropic, on Lex Friedman's podcast recently. And it's so interesting listening to him speak about how to try to anticipate the intention of the user, because they're dealing with a design challenge where they called it the certainly test, where Claude would always go, certainly, like, I'll help you with that, and just constantly say certainly over and over again. And he's like, I mean, even if we try to train the model to not do that, what if it comes up with definitely, or you bet, or, there's always going to be something, and there's always unanticipated consequences to fixing one thing, and then something else starts to happen in terms of behaviors. The other thing I thought that was very interesting is capturing the intent of the user is actually quite hard in some cases, where if you want it to be brief, because it used to be very verbose when you would work with Claude, and now they've actually kind of trained it to be a little bit more brief, but like kind of find the sweet spot there. But if you're doing code development, you don't necessarily want it to be brief. Like, they got a lot of complaints that it was like, and put the rest of your code here. It was trying to be brief in its response, but you actually want it to be a little bit verbose because you want it to be complete. And so, how do you capture that intention from the user appropriately. And so I thought it was just fascinating to listen to him kind of talk about some of the testing cases and edge cases. And I'll note one more thing that was really interesting from that podcast, and I would highly suggest people go and listen to it. I mean, I think it is 3.5 hours. But it's really good, and it's not all him. They bring in the woman that actually oversees crafting the personality for the model as well, which is actually pretty fascinating. But they have these different tests in terms of kind of a threat test, if you will, on the model itself, because everyone, has all of these theories about this existential threat of these models getting more and more sophisticated. So he breaks down the classification of the outcomes from that test and how they determine that classification of that model before they actually release it. And he makes some predictions as to when he believes these models will get to those higher thresholds of, I don't know how to put it, maybe danger. I don't know. Dangerous capability, maybe.
What's his timeline? What's his doomsday clock? Is it?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
he talks about, I can't remember the exact levels, but he's fairly confident that we'll hit the next level of dangerous capability next year. He thinks AGI will be here at least within the next 5 years. So he's pretty, I think, aggressive on that. He also talks about in the beginning of the podcast on his idea of like scaling in terms of performance. Like he believes there's still a lot more scale left, scaling on data, scaling on infrastructure to increase performance. And so he thinks that will continue. But he's like, at the end of the day, we don't know, right? We don't know if we're going to hit some theoretical limit that we just haven't hit yet in terms of performance on that. So yeah, it's a fascinating listen if you haven't heard it yet.
That's the first time I've heard claims for like next year or next 5 years. That's interesting.
Yeah, I saw a talk between the chief product officer of Anthropic and OpenAI, and that was really interesting because they're talking through like this evolution of the user's perception too, right? Because we're getting more used to working with AI, right? So we're kind of developing this relationship. And they even talk about, and when they said this out loud, I noticed it too. I was like, oh, Claude talks to you one way, and then ChatGPT talks to you another way. So you kind of like have a different feel. Like talking to Claude is like someone's helping me do my work, and then ChatGPT is kind of like I'm Googling and reading and it's summarizing for me. Is kind of how, at least how I'm using the two separately. So it's just kind of interesting to think through that dimension of it as well. As it's like these things are getting to the point now where it feels more conversational to the point where you're anthropomorphizing them even more, which is kind of scary because we're already doing that so much. And now it's like, oh, they have like different personalities that they're building out.
Yeah. They have people dedicated to those personalities too, which I think is super, super fascinating. Yeah, it's pretty wild.
I think that's relevant for companies too, because a lot of companies, especially large enterprises, are focusing on their own internal conversational models in that way as well. What is the personality that we want to bake in for our associates in terms of conversating with us, the company overall, the brand, the marketing of it all too, like our voice.
Yeah, it is interesting. They are kind of naming these, entities, if you will, of how every associate or employee engages with it across the entire organization. Or to your point, externally, how do we brand this person that represents our company? I'm going to put person in quotes.
Don't call it a person.
It's not a person.
Yeah.
But, a perceived person, right, that represents our company to the world and how they engage with us as an organization. I wonder how far organizations are going to go on customizing that experience and how you think about it.
All right, if you had to name a bot right now, like you had to pick, I know one of our clients, they chose Alice. Like, what would you choose for that like default internal one? I feel like Boris. I would go with Boris.
I was gonna say Igor. Yeah, like something memorable.
Igor's good. That's a good one.
Igor's good. I don't know why, but the name Tamra came to the
Tamra. Okay.
Tamra, can you help me with this?
Yeah.
I think it's great.
Well, everybody, we have Bhavna from Cincinnati Children's Hospital joining for the next half of our episode. So we're going to flip over to that conversation, and we'll see you over there. All right, for today's guest, we have Bhavna Mehta. Bhavna, good morning. How are you? Thanks for joining.
Good morning. I'm good, Nick. How are you?
Good. Thanks for hopping on. For our audience, Bhavna has been a longstanding friend of the show, friend of us, Reagan, Brendan, and myself as well. So we're excited to finally have you join. And really just as we talked about before, we had some discussions even ahead of this recording, just casual conversations around like what you've noticed in 2024 and things that are coming up. But I think first, Bhavna, just for our audience, could you provide some background around your role, your career overall, and a lot of the work you do, especially related to AI in your organization today?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, so good morning. So, like Nick said, I'm Bhavna Mehta. I'm at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center, and my role there is an AVP of Data and Analytics. So, what that means is I lead our data and analytics strategy, including our data governance, AI governance, analytics, business intelligence, right, platforms, and all of that, the technology side as well as the process and the enablement and data literacy as well. And from a career perspective, I grew up as a software engineer, which is actually really cool to see because AI is using all the principles of software engineering. So it kind of feels like full circle, even though I'm not hands-on. But I think the my early career experience is really helping me, think through and formulate and really work and talk intelligently with my team, right? As we progress and do more of AI. So that has really been our focus over the last year has been to set up the team. I have a new team that we started about 15 months ago. So it's been super exciting to get that team up and running and then starting the pilot projects, some infrastructure, which we can, obviously I can share learnings with the group as we talk.
Especially with the time of the year that we're at, coming up on the end of 2024, just reflecting on the past 11 or so months, what would you say has been one of the biggest themes or even like top two themes of your focus and your team's focus in your organization?
I think the top two themes, which may not be surprising, I'm sure everyone's going through that, right? One is just the AI ethics and governance, and especially in healthcare, as we're looking to implement models, that has been top of mind. We have, there are a lot of tools coming out, there are models, even our organization, as we're developing, but that has been a top of mind discussion and frameworks. And as I've talked to my peers, uh, both within children's or outside, as a network. That's, I think, a pretty key theme that as we're implementing that, how do we use AI from an ethical perspective, as well as how do we use AI to augment humans, right? I think there's a little bit of um, sort of concern. It's around change management. It's around, like, is it going to replace my job and those kinds of things. So that's definitely one of the trends that I think everyone's seeing. The other one I would say is on the enablement and literacy side, especially on the Gen AI, right? We've seen it come up so fast, and the pace of technology is just so fast. So trying to think through how do we leverage that both in our day-to-day life, right, which I think there are some early adopters, some are trying to see, okay, is it what are the right roles, as well as trying to see, okay, how can we use that for applications and AI systems, and going beyond our day-to-day life. So I would say those were the top two. There are plenty others that fork from there, but I think those are the top two that I've kind of been focused on and have noticed more.
Yeah, and healthcare can't get any more high risk, I feel like. Right, we're literally talking life and death. And so, from that lens, we have a lot of risk conversations with our enterprise customers as well. How do you think about use cases? Obviously, the first couple, you want to focus on kind of building the muscle and getting people comfortable. And so, but you also want it to make an impact and show, a significant amount of value so that you can gain that momentum. How are you thinking about use cases within the healthcare ecosystem for AI?
I think it actually runs the gamut because, again, healthcare, like any other industry, has obviously operations opportunities, which is low risk, and we can definitely try those and show the value of AI or how it can help augment decisions through that. So whether that's predictions, I mean, one of the things is like census predictions, how many patients are going to show up, what is the probability of admission for a patient, still having a human in the loop, but those kinds of things, as well as supply chain marketing, right? I mean, we've got finance, like we've got those traditional areas as well. But then when you think about clinical use cases, diagnostic is there, but it's more from like a decision support perspective. So can we predict deterioration and show that and put an alert in the EHR to tell the the clinician to say, hey, this might be something of high risk, or even from a Gen AI perspective, thinking about summarization. So think about the information that is in the medical chart. It is huge, right? So when you have a patient in front of you and the clinician's looking at and wants to tease out the best, the thought to focus on, there's a lot of information they have to weed through. So helping using Gen AI to summarize that information and saying these are the key things, I think that's another use case. Ambient scribes is another use case, right? So just having helping with transcription. So as the physician and the patients are having conversations, if you can have ambient scribes, so then the physician can really help continue to talk to the patient. So a lot of use cases are in the space of how can we reduce clinician burden. That's definitely when you think about healthcare. The other area from a healthcare research perspective is I think there's a lot of opportunity to expedite the implementation of some of the research models or the models that have come out of
Oh, sure.
research over the
Yeah.
last several years to short circuit that life cycle. So that's also an area that we're experimenting with.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think and governance too is like such a loaded term, I think.
Yes.
So from your lens, like practically who's sitting at the table to have these kinds of discussions and what does this actually operationally look like? Obviously you have to have discussions about which use cases, but there's also a lot of technical discussions about how do we like ensure that it's, aligned to what we're originally trying to do. So who sits at the table and what sorts of conversations are you having around governance?
Yeah, I think, we've all heard the term analytics as the team sport. I think this one's like even a team sport on steroids, right? Because I think it's so multidisciplinary when you think about it. So, on even on that AI governance council, so we have an AI governance council. We actually have, to your point, a working group under that from a tactical perspective, where we have practitioners pulled together like a community of practice. But on the governance council, we have our security officer, our ethics officer, we've got legal, we've got our research faculty, we've got clinicians, we've got our medical information officer, we've got our nursing informatics officer. So it's a really really and IT folks. So I co-lead it with another faculty member. So we meet monthly, and the first thing that we really did was create a framework around what are the key things we want to look at, right? So I think some of the things which are not surprising, you want to make sure the model is accurate for sure. That's one thing, right? But I think the two concepts that we've kind of really trying to dig into is that is it valuable and is it trustworthy? So I think when you start to think about it in those terms and you really say, okay, is the decision that it's helping us drive, what value does it provide, right, to it? Is it truly, what's the impact? And reversely, is there a harm? So I think from a patient care perspective, you also have to think about make sure that it's not doing any harm, not that as it's positive, but it's also doesn't have a negative impact. And then from a trustworthy perspective, that's where you start to think about the concepts like explainability or alignment with existing knowledge. So will it be the same thing if we offered that information to a clinician based on their training and their knowledge? Would they come up with the same output or the same decision? So I think that's where the trustworthy also comes into play. So those are the two key concepts that we anchored into. And there's, of course, like I said, a framework. Those are ongoing discussions. There's always something new coming up, and we're talking about it. And to your point, yes, also thinking through use cases. If there's a new use cases all over the board, whether we're buying new technology, because we know that new technology has embedded AI in it, right? So really thinking about that. And then whether we're developing something internally or we're trying to license something from the outside, right? It's just kind of all over the gamut that we try to evaluate that. And I think the other thing is also from an IP and this whole like what does the vendor do if we send our data? So I think that's another piece, thinking about those legal contracts. And so we talk about all that.
And I think a lot of teams feel the burden of wanting to have all of that figured out before they can have a use case get through there too. And we constantly emphasize just getting started and like working on those, as you mentioned, the financial value and the risk. We're going to iterate on our understanding of that as we go through more and more. Do you have any advice for folks just to get started in getting some of these use cases rolled out and not getting that analysis paralysis, just not feeling like they're not ready, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's getting started. I think it's important that it's a team, that you have the right people, because I think that's one of the things, right? We don't know what we don't know. So having more people and just getting started, going slowly. I mean, I think it's a balance of getting doing something fast but yet being careful. So I think that definitely is something to think about. And there's lots of information, honestly. Like, we can continue to talk. There's such great ideas. Uh, the big thing is, even if you have the model, I think one of the key things is, how do you implement that in the workflow? And that nobody can tell us, right? Outside of our own organization. So I think tapping into those resources, so we have that built around it, will help us do that safely, and in a calculated, like, you taking that risk in a calculated way.
Yeah, and is that the biggest hurdle or friction point that you've seen in a lot of these use cases? Is it getting it into the hands of the users and making sure they're comfortable with it, or where have you kind of been? Where have you seen like the biggest bottleneck in that process of getting use cases out the door?
Uh, I have to just say, we're very fortunate at Children's. We're a very data driven organization. So it's sometimes we have the other problem. We have too many use cases and too many. But I think it's about, I don't think it's as much the user side. There's part of it there too, depending on the use case. Of course, there's training, there's change management. I think it's really about making sure we're hitting all the gates, right? In an academic organization, sometimes it's new knowledge. So really thinking about, what's the impact. I don't know if you guys read the Gartner CIO IT symposium this year was around AI, right? So, and one of the key things that I think I took away was that AI, in the past, we've always thought about as that, let's measure IT outcomes, business outcomes, but they also called out behavioral outcomes, which was really interesting. And that is some of the things that we are kind of thinking through, is like, what's the impact on behavior when we do that? Are we changing behavior? So one of the things that, as we're testing something out, and we're really saying, okay, are we, by just telling someone that they might have a likelihood of, of say anxiety or something, are we actually increasing the likelihood of having anxiety, right? So I think, so some of those questions that we're struggling with, and I would say we're not all the way there, Brendan, to say that it's full scale AI adopted. So I don't think I have seen the resistance yet. The resistance is more around in terms of challenges, because it's still new. There's still real technical complexity in getting this implemented. And I think the frustration sometimes comes when the technology is not working, right? I mean, it can dampen the excitement. So I think that's the balance. That's more than anything else.
Yeah, one of our advisors said that it was like 80 or 20% of the effort gets you 80% of the way there. And 80% of the effort is that last 20% of performance that actually makes it useful and drives adoption. And so I feel like we're hearing that so much. It's like the power of Gen AI is getting a solution built quickly, but then to get it to actually be usable and put it in production and make sure it's trustworthy, that's like the bulk of the challenge. Is that what you're kind of experiencing as well?
Say, yeah, absolutely, right. So you can get somewhere. It's that last mile, and then, the operation, the model ops, having clear guiding principles on when are we going to evaluate, how are we going to document drift, who all needs to see it, where are we going to surface it, how are we going to really, uh, you know, clearly, it's that explainability and interpretability, right? Like, how are we going to send the inference over, or show how we're going to integrate it so that it doesn't feel burdensome, but it's actually helpful.
One of the biggest pain points we hear, Bhavna, and I would love your perspective on this, especially being the clinical space. I think clinicians are some of the most busy, obviously, workers across industries, but reaching them, helping them to understand how Gen AI and AI can support their work, but also integrating into their workflows. And if they have an AI idea, knowing the groups and committees that exist within your hospital system to go to, right? How have you managed that funnel of ideas going to the right teams, and then ultimately keeping that engagement with the idea submitter, maybe, or even the team it impacts, to understand the workflow thoroughly and like help support them through the whole process?
Yeah, so I think, again, it's been an iterative process. Like I said, over the last 15 months, we've kind of accelerated some of that, and it's initially we actually had an engagement with one of the consulting companies. We brought someone in, did like landscape engagement where we talked to our key stakeholders, and that was about 15 months ago, to identify some of those key use cases aligning with our goals. I think one of the key things is we could get as many ideas. We're going to make sure that it aligns with our strategic priorities and it's actually, as it's meeting, because again, we have a lot of pet projects and you can only do so many, right? So I think that is one of the key things is as we get those ideas. But we did start with that initial list of use cases, which we picked one or two to begin with. And I think as we started to roll that or work on those, also started to communicate, and it had to go on a roadshow literally to kind of share that with a few folks as well. The AI, our council is a good 25 plus members, so which represents a pretty broad area of the organization. So there are key people that people talk to. I think anytime people think of AI, that's one thing I think is good. People do think of security. So we got a lot of ideas through our chief security officer, right? Which is kind of cool. That's a good funnel to have, so that was one funnel for sure. We've recently actually developed like a website on our internet site. We've been doing more marketing through newsletters. So I think that's been some of the ways. But the key thing to think about is that when we get an idea is to say, does it align with our goals? What is it going to help? Who are the right stakeholders? Who is it going to impact? It's kind of that product management, if you will, in a different way, but it's kind of the same thing, right? But it's really isn't how do you develop that AI system all the way to the end.
So happy you said that, because I don't think enough teams are thinking about this, like product management side of all of this, right? Aligning to strategic value, who's the owner of the solution from idea all the way back to implementation as well, just to make sure it doesn't fall through the cracks. And we test urgency, and there is obviously leader buy-in for the idea actually getting implemented, and then tracking, right? The value that it actually provides, whether measurable dollars and cents or alignment to strategic unlocks that we're trying to do in the years ahead too. That's great.
Yeah, I was actually just having a conversation this morning about it's interesting because product management is a great word for how do we align to the business and our goals and where we want to go. And there's such an interesting dimension with AI of like feasibility of not only the data, the architecture, the vendor we're working with. And I was kind of like trying to get a good word for it. It's like this product, and then there's some architecture. So it's a like solution architecture and product, and like how do we think about those two halves of that coin that kind of need to come together: business side, data, technical side. I think it's such an interesting part about AI.
Yeah, for sure. And you're right. I think the first time we used that language, AI product, we even got the question saying, "Hey, what is an AI product? What do you mean by that?" So I think we've kind of used, and honestly, like I've started using that less in terms of sort of outside, but like internally in our team, as we start to drive that concept, I think it's still helpful to say, hey, it's like a retail product in some case. Like, who is the customer? How are we going to manage features of it? How are we going to do releases of it? And again, I think that's an evolving uh, sort of capability. At least, I know in our area, but I've also talked to many others that it is an evolving capability across the board that folks are struggling with to think about that whole life cycle to make it work.
I think what's incredible too, when you opened and said all of the functions that you oversee, on the analytics side, I heard this really great quote. I think it was from Cassie Kozyrkov, who was formerly at Google, but she said like analytics are a great way to tell you where to dig. And then AI is the digging and like hitting oil or whatever you want to call it. Right. So I think it's so interesting that you have kind of analytics, data, and AI because, there's a huge dependency on data quality for AI to work. So having autonomy to be able to make some of those data governance decisions and I guess also benefit from all the hard work you probably did to lay out that data foundation, right? And then even having the analytics team to say, like, where is the biggest opportunity? How do we measure that? How do we look at attribution of this AI solution to that particular KPI? The best, most mature companies we've talked to are very KPI driven around AI. So I'd be curious to hear, like, maybe how some of those pieces are interwoven into some of the work you're doing with AI as well.
Yeah, definitely. So, we have our KPIs, and we actually in our organization work in a federated model. So, my team is like the hub, and we have the hub and spoke, so the center of excellence. So, we have, an analytics team that's even outside, which is our QI team in operation, but we're joined at the hip, honestly. Like, we work very closely. with them. And then there are several other teams across the organization, but then we have a community of practice around that. So it's helpful. So we get, honestly, it's a top down, bottom up community, right? That we get ideas and we all work together to create that culture, honestly, of that innovation and that agility and that data driven culture. So you're right. I think we have our KPIs, and that's one of the things that we do as align to. So, like for example, I talked about census predictions, right? Predicting how many kids come in. So, one of our wildly important goals as a CEO would say is access, which again we provide exceptional care, but we want kids to be able to see us, right? So again, to be able to predict how many kids are going to get admission, get admitted is connected directly to access, right? Because we know how many beds we need, so again, anytime we do a model like that, we try to see if there's an organizational KPI that we can impact, and we would want to measure those. If there is baseline numbers for it, is there a clear definition from a data governance perspective? If we don't have one, we would want to document that data governance and go through the data governance process. Are there existing dashboards, reports available from a descriptive diagnostic analysis perspective that might be able to help or might be able to be used to plug that inference from the model back in? So we're not creating something new, but actually using what's already there and integrating that into the workflow. And then from, to your point, a data engineering and data quality perspective, there's sometimes new streams of data needed, right? So really thinking about, do we have that data? Do we have it in the right format with the right quality? We're right now working on streaming data. We didn't have that initially, but now for some of the models, you need streaming data. So how do we start to build that capability? What does that look like? And then even taking it one further, we're not there yet, but the vision would be to start creating, reusable sort of microservices, right, out of our AI models or even data. So I do think, yes, having all these connected together is definitely helps to move faster and move in alignment, I would say, more than anything else.
Great segue into my kind of next and final question for you, Bhavna. We talked about 2024 and big learnings. You talked a little bit about looking ahead and what excites you, especially with just so many of the inspiration work that you're doing, like to support children and getting access to them. What excites you about 2025 around just like things that you're working on or AI capabilities overall that you're really looking to try and unlock in the year ahead?
Yeah, no, thanks. I think there's a lot going on. Some of it is extension, right, of 2024. We have some really great projects in the pipeline. So definitely that excites me. I think one is seeing the entire, a lot of us like embracing AI differently is definitely one. So it does the literacy portion of does excite me when everyone's coming together and talking the same language. That's definitely something. The technology, as much as it, or the promise of technology, as much as it excites me, also kind of keeps me in check, right? Like everyone else, because we got to make the right decisions. But we have some really cool projects. We're testing out even conversational AI agents and things like that. So I think that's coming in the next year. Coming from this year going into next year, which I hope to see them into fruition and actually making an impact, and we can a measurable impact.
I really appreciate how this whole conversation that you've been having with us has been so focused on supporting clinicians and ultimately supporting patients that come in, right? And like orienting the strategy around that and the capabilities too. We're so happy to have you finally on our show, Bhavna. Thank you so much for your time today. It was such a pleasure. If folks want to reach out to you, should they, add you on LinkedIn? Is there any other ways that you'd like folks to get in contact if they want to?
Yeah, LinkedIn is always great. Yeah, I'm happy to expand my network any day. Yes, that'd be great.
Great. We'll link your LinkedIn in the description for everybody. Bhavna, thank you again so much for your time today. We appreciate it. And for everybody else, thank you for listening in to today's AI or Die podcast episode. Thanks, everybody.